Good morning and welcome to the journey to net zero. My name is Leslie Davis. I work for the Archdiocese of New York in the Energy Management Department. I'd like to introduce our first panelist. His name is Donovan Gordon, and he's the Director of Clean Heating and Cooling for NYSERDA.
Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
Very good, thank you.
Our next panelist is Gregory Elcock, and he's the Director of Clean Heating and Cooling for Edison. Good morning, Gregory. How are you?
Hi. Good morning, all. Can folks hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
I'm unable to hear anything.
I'm sorry, you can't hear us? Well, Tansy will take care of that in the background. Our next guest is Christopher Halfnight, and he's the Director of Policy at Urban Green Council. Good morning,
everybody. Good morning, Leslie. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Our next guest is Owen Brady-Traczyk, and he is the Manager of the Future of Heat at the National Grid.
Good morning, everybody. Leslie, thank you.
Greg, we're going to need you to unmute.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you well. Can you hear us?
I can hear you now well, yes.
Yeah.
All right, again, welcome to the Journey to Net Zero. This morning's discussion is going to talk about how New York is going to get to that area, to net zero. And we know that over the past years, everyone has been having an increased awareness of climate change and its effects. And there's been a total global shift towards preserving the global climate system. And this includes attempts to move us to net zero by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In December 2021, the federal administration unveiled ambitious climate goals with plans of achieving 65% reduction of emissions from the federal operations by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. This is extremely ambitious. So I would like to know from each of you how these goals can be realized on a federal level and also on a city level and also on a state level, and how will this affect the climate efforts in New York? I think our first panelist from Con Ed, Mr. Elcock, can start off.
Sure. So I think, I would start off by saying the first thing that we really need to recognize there needs to be, alignment of mission. We have federal goals that are coupled with state goals that are coupled with city goals. And I think part of the very initial alignment is that there needs to be, that alignment of mission and that folks understand, the mission that we're trying to achieve. It makes, those of us who are closer to execution, it facilitates, I think, an easier execution of the mission. I'll start with that.
Okay. And let's take it from another area, which is urban policy. So, Chris, what do you think?
I think in the urban environment, really what we need to see is scaling as rapidly as possible. And, that means through demonstration projects that are proving out the technologies, through pilots that are helping test different strategies in implementation in buildings. And I think the faster the money can flow from the federal government down through the states and to the cities and municipalities for implementation, the better we'll be, and we'll have sort of the on the ground data to inform the direction that we want the alignment that Greg mentioned.
Okay. Now, we know that New York is a large state and it's very diverse. And there are many, many competing interests. Some of them do align and some of them are competing. So you'll have upstate, you have us in New York City. But one of the issues that has continually come up is about having inclusion and making sure that these measures are equitable to everyone across New York, which again is also a big bite to take off the apple. So I would like to ask Owen from National Grid, and also Owen, I would also like you to state your region so that we can have a context to your answer. But let us know how you feel we can make sure that these measures are equitable.
Of course, Leslie. And my region, in fact, I serve all of National Grid's U.S. service territory. So that includes downstate New York, New York City and Long Island, as well as upstate and then Massachusetts. So we have a pretty wide swath of area to work with and therefore a lot of different populations that we also are trying to serve. And the important thing about working at a utility is that we want to have a relatively standard offering that creates value for all. And we're really blessed in that we have engaged, thoughtful regulators that are helping us work through different solutions that we may present and helping to ensure that there is some equity in that process, right? So that's a great way for voices to be at the table and to think about the impacts across society. One of the things I would just say is that I really think it's incredibly important as we are at this sort of inflection point where there is a lot of consideration of future investments that will be made for people to get engaged in that process, right? We are, as a regulated entity, overseen by a group that helps to advocate on behalf of all of our ratepayers. But it's also really important for those ratepayers, those customers, to be at the table, to be making their voices heard, and to participate in that regulatory process, because we want to know what people want. We can do surveys, we can do focus groups, we can certainly try to gather as much information as possible to ensure that we are acting in the best interest of our customers. But the best way for us to do that is to hear from them and to be able to have them as an active voice in the regulatory process.
Okay, you mentioned something important. I just want you to sort of elaborate on it. You said that we're overseeing, so we do have students in the audience. So I want to make sure that they understand sort of what the hierarchy is in terms of NYSERDA, in terms of the utilities and understanding. So I'm going to use an acronym, PSE, but I would love for you to elaborate just so they can understand a little bit more how we work.
Of course. And so as a utility, we are a regulated entity, meaning that we are operating as a natural monopoly within the state. So that means we are installing a specific asset class or multiple asset classes, depending upon the structure in a market. Typically, natural gas and electricity are the two services that are distributed by utilities. And we are granted a monopoly right within a given area, franchise area, that allows us to be that provider. And the reason for this is it would be inefficient to have multiple entities installing competing natural gas pipeline networks or competing sets of wires. So it was determined that this was a more efficient and manageable way for the market to sort of progress and be developed. However, because we are a monopoly and we don't have competition effectively, then we need to ensure that there is oversight of our operations and a prudency review of the programs that we are undertaking and the spend and investment that we are making on behalf of customers. So the Public Service Commission in New York State is the group that oversees the activity of the regulators, along with the Department of Public Service staff. And they are the ones that review our rate case filings as well as our ongoing program and operations to ensure that we are upholding all aspects of sort of the regulatory compact and any requirements that are placed on us, and that everything that we are doing is prudent from the determination of their review on behalf of our ratepayers.
Okay, thank you. And Gregory, Con Edison works very much the same way. I just wanted to say to the students also that the Public Service Commission is not, it's not a closed door behind the scenes. There is a website, and you can always go and see what type of measures or regulatory items are there. So it is extensive. There's a lot to read, but it gives you an interesting take on how all of this works together. And when we talk about people being inclusive and having their voice heard, it's just a place for you to get information. So you do have the opportunity to step out and learn more on your own. Yep. My next question is, what is the biggest obstacle that we need to overcome to achieve these climate goals? So I'm sure there's a different aspect from each one of you. I would love to go to NYSERDA because, and just take a minute just to explain what NYSERDA is, who they are.
Well, NYSERDA is an acronym, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. We're basically New York State's energy policy analysis hub. and our focus is now on clean, renewable energy. I'm going to try to tie some of these questions together.
Okay.
You mentioned the carbon reduction goals, greenhouse gas reduction goals. And in New York State, we do have goals codified in law that by 2030, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas by 40% from our 1990 levels by 2030, and by 85% by 2050. The important question to ask within that is, what's causing carbon emissions? What percentage of what is causing the emissions in the state? And approximately 45% come from transportation, and about 33%, about a third, is coming from buildings. My focus is on buildings. We don't make cars here, so it's electric vehicles and electric heat pumps. So when we talk about inclusion and we look at buildings, how can we reduce our carbon emissions? First, we need to consume less energy, so more energy efficient equipment, but also more energy efficient buildings, insulation, for these larger buildings, facades. Those are job opportunities. And again, installing air source, ground source, water source, heat pumps. Those are all job opportunities to train skilled workers at all levels, from engineering down to installers. As it relates to some of the challenges, what I'll say to the students, Owen was alluding to this, anything utilities do, Public Service Commission does, it's public. Everything that's being contemplated is put out for public review and comment. So anyone here can review the documents, review their rate cases, review policy recommendations, and opine on it and give their opinion on it. So you don't have to be invited. You could just show up and insert yourself. So you have that right. In terms of the hurdles and barriers, awareness, people are not aware of these technologies. The cost, they're new. So it is more expensive than the incumbent technologies. And three, training and having skilled workers to do the task. So it's difficult, but it's doable, because we're transitioning from what has traditionally been a fossil fuel-based economy to a clean energy-based economy. And what we want is to make sure that every citizen, certainly in New York State, resident in New York State, that has the ability and the desire to participate can be trained and get good paying jobs in this field.
Okay. Gregory, you are the Director of Clean Heat for Con Edison. And I know that Con Edison also participates in a lot of training. But what are some of the barriers you see in terms of implementing projects, just basic projects right now in terms of heat pumps?
Yeah. So let me start with this. What we're seeing right now, just to make some connection to what Don's saying, buildings are probably going to be one of the most important sectors as we begin to drive decarbonization, because we're going to have a big impact there. And typically today, or in recent history of the development of New York, electric heating has not been the go-to thing, right? It's been, heating via, steam or hot water, as the case may be. So the first hurdle to me is getting that understanding of the connection between the folks doing this work and the policy challenge, right? So when let's say you go to a building, a small building, be it your single family house or your co-op building or the board that you're working with to do that replacement, your go-to is probably going to be whatever exists, and that's the simplest thing to do. So I think the first challenge that we're seeing is awareness, understanding, getting the folks that actually do this work to begin to stop and think about making these electrification changes. And then the economics has to work, right? Generally speaking, someone is looking to make a change. They're looking to make that change for probably the least cost method. I think that is changing. And, in some instances, the economics does work. But increasingly, those three things, I think, have to really triangulate for us to begin to scale significantly in this decarbonization effort. Donovan, I think you were going to add something.
Yeah, I'm going to add something to this. just to put it in perspective, there are over 7 million buildings in New York State that we need to convert from fossil fuel-based heating to electric, non-fossil fuel-based heating and cooling. And I did mention that a third of the carbon emissions in the state comes from buildings. And I know Chris can verify this. In New York City, approximately 67% of the carbon emissions in New York City comes from buildings. So in terms of where to focus on having a big impact on greenhouse gas emissions in the state, it's New York City.
Yep.
I think there was
New York City buildings, getting that workforce trained.
I do want to step backwards. No, I want to step backwards a little bit because I did it again. We, again, are all aware what clean heat means. When we talk about heat pumps, what that means. So who would like to just take a brief moment to explain what we mean by clean heat? And actually, the title of this program is Journey to Net Zero.
Okay, I'll do that. In my title is Director of Clean Heating and Cooling for New York State. So Mr. Gordon. So a fossil fuel system, the current systems that we use now, takes a fuel, whether it's oil, propane, or natural gas, and burns it to create the heat and distributes it to a building. And that's what's caused the greenhouse gas emissions, right? Both carbon dioxide and monoxide, because we're burning the fuel. A heat pump is driven by electricity, transfers heat from one place to another. And the places where it primarily transfers heat from is the air, we call it air source heat pumps, the ground source heat pumps or geothermal, or water source heat pumps. Those are the primary areas. Now you could also waste heat from data centers or exhaust systems. There are other areas that you can take heat and transfer it, but that's the fundamental difference. And because there's no combustion of a fuel on site, there is zero emissions, carbon emissions on site. Now, the source is very different because you may use fossil fuels to generate the electricity, but we want to get to a clean electric grid. But on site, a heat pump does not produce any carbon emissions because there's nothing burning on site.
And so the question that someone would ask is, oh my God, so why doesn't everybody just run out, rip out their gas boilers and throw in a heat pump today?
Well,
and let's talk, because there's geothermal also. Mm-hmm. Why is it that people are just not running out to Home Depot and getting a heat pump or calling their contractor and having that put in immediately?
Well, it goes back to the 3 barriers that I mentioned. Most of them are not aware of it. The cost is high because it's still a new technology. It's not new technology, but it's not like gas boilers and furnaces where there's a mass supply chain established, and there aren't that many skilled workers to do this. There's only a handful of folks that know how to install geothermal. Air source heat pumps a little bit easier, but most HVAC contractors are making their living installing boilers and furnaces. And oh, by the way, this is something good for you for all these college and high school students. Within the next 5 years, close to 50% of all contractors, including HVAC contractors, will be retiring. So we need to fill those vacancies, plus build more jobs for the clean energy sector.
That's good news, students.
Lots of opportunities here.
I want to talk a little bit about data. So I'm going to come over to you, Mr. Halfnight, and talk about data in New York City. Well, maybe not New York City, in terms of New York State, because we're talking about accessibility, we're talking about priorities and how we get there. I feel that New York has a very unique building stock. We do have some of the oldest buildings. So there are other states that do have a lot of buildings, but in terms of our building stock, that will still be here 20, 30 years from now. So we're not knocking everything down and building new buildings. But how much of, in terms of percentage, if you know, it would be considered affordable housing as opposed to some of our luxury buildings? Because I think my concern, or the concern of some of the building owners, is, again, when we talk about having the money to do that and the policies put in place, even for affordable housing developers, to get that money to do these changes?
I don't have the specific breakdown of affordable housing in New York City or statewide versus market rate. I don't know, Donovan, if you have those numbers at your fingertips, but
well, I know in New York City, NYCHA is the largest multifamily developer in New York City.
Okay, so just dealing with policy with NYCHA, so we can just throw that out there and sort of cover a lot of things. How would you, as someone who's done messaging, get that type of message out, maybe on the ground level? What would your idea be? Not that you would do it, but what would your idea be to make sure that that group is included?
Well, I'm talking to them on a pretty regular basis. So it's not the obviously it's public housing. So you're dealing with the city who owns these properties, and they're dealing with the federal government, HUD. Right. So it's complex because they're regulated. But I could tell you for a fact that NYCHA is very committed to electrification and decarbonization of their buildings, and they're looking at ways to do that. So it's how we obviously afford it, or they can afford, or have a third party come in. I mean, they don't own the electric wires, they don't own the gas pipes, they pay for usage. So we can take that capital cost out, and they just pay monthly fees. So it's a financial structure. But and one thing I'll also say is that under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is CPA, between 35% and 40% of, they said, all the benefits, which is going to be billions of dollars that's invested in clean energy throughout to really 2050, has to, not needs to, well, needs to, has to go to what they classify as disadvantaged communities. So
that's good to know.
It's with an eye to make sure, and it's just not just having the technologies, but training the residents of these communities for decent paying jobs. So the focus of, so it's climate leadership, which is the environmental part, and community protection act, which is really focused on low to moderate income, marginalized communities, and what they call disadvantaged communities.
And again, that's public information. Owen and Gregory are sort of the face forward, right? So Con Ed, we know about NYSERDA, but the average person will see a National Grid bill, they will see a Con Ed bill. Do you have any systems in place to inform people of what the new world is going to look like, will look like in the future?
I think in terms of general outreach, with respect to our programs and with respect to, well, one, with respect to our programs, yes, and then two, as a general matter, kind of listeners put together, and for the students on the line or others that are interested, we have put together what we call a clean energy commitment that really lays out the pillars of how Edison thinks about its interaction with the entire clean energy ecosystem going forward. And I think it makes a good read, if I do say so myself, but it lays out multiple aspects of how we really plan to engage as a company very broadly and holistically. One, so that's from the from that end. And then specifically with respect to our programs, here in the service territory, we do have clean energy programs of all aspects for all sectors of the community, meaning that discounted light bulb that you would buy in Home Depot is probably in some way subsidized by one of our efficiency programs, all the way through to where the topic du jour, right, of heat pumps, right, is something that we have really proactively gone out there and advocated for, and incentivized at significant, so much so that burning very, very warm, I should say, particularly in residential, which is where a lot of us.
You mentioned a word that I love, and it's called incentive. Obviously, I know what it is again, but why don't, if you can, especially in the clean heat and the heat pump, let us just know a little bit about what Con Ed, and then we'll go to National Grid, has done to incentivize this
So
program?
I always believe I'll start then and get good way, but I'll make it very simple for folks who are listening in. It's really incentivizing. These are really meant to buy down the cost. So let's use an example. The total install cost of a product costs $1,000 or $5,000, and the utility, by virtue of elections that it would have made and authorized to do so by later, as Owen mentioned earlier, use those funds as part of our programming to buy down the cost of heat pumps and really all manner of high efficiency equipment. We've been doing that in the latest incarnation at Con-Ed in 2009 or so to date.
And National Grid?
We, of course, have a similar approach to incentives and overall energy efficiency programs. We do try to learn from each other as sort of utility partners and ensure that we're adopting best practices. That's one of the benefits of having a common oversight body, is that they are aware of what Con-Ed is doing. And so they can say to National Grid, have you talked to Con-Ed, or can you adopt the same structure? Because they want it to be easy and predictable for the market. And so it wouldn't make sense for one street over things to change, right? We want to make sure that to the extent that there are neighboring service territories, that it's easy for customers and easy for contractors and those that are installing the equipment to be able to know how the utility incentive programs are working. So we do try to adopt similar structures. One thing I would just add for those that may not be aware of this, going back to Donovan's excellent point about everything being fully public, when we run our energy efficiency programs, every incentive that is proposed and then eventually adopted has to go through a benefit cost analysis, or BCA. And that allows us to set the incentive rate at a level where there is sufficient benefits that are accrued because of the cost, or in response to the cost effectively. And so if you've ever wondered why, the incentive for a heat pump is set at the level that it is, there's an entire process that we go through where we say, here is what we believe will happen based off of what we've seen in the market, what we've seen from our energy systems in response to additional adoption of heat pumps or LED light bulbs or whatever the incentive measure may be for. And so therefore, we're able to establish an incentive rate that we feel is still prudent on behalf of customers, because even these incentive dollars at the end of the day are funded through rates. And so we don't want to set a massively high incentive rate, because then that creates a situation where some people are getting a very high incentive rate, but every ratepayer is paying for that. So we need to be very mindful of the level at which the incentives are set. As we see changing awareness of and structures surrounding quantifying and assigning a value to emissions impacts, I expect that will become factored into that incentive setting structure in a more pronounced way. And so certainly we may see a shift over time in terms of the level of incentive that can be set and still be justified as beneficial based off of the benefits that are being accrued due to the adoption of that incentive.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you mentioned that.
I was just going to add, just to round out Owen's point, that what has happened over the last 2 years or in New York State, the programming side, is that we now have what we call a statewide clean heat program, which really encompasses all of the clean heat work with very similar rules, very similar methods of operation. Incentives may be slightly different depending on the service territory, but generally aligned, so that if a vendor or contractor wants to operate in the or the city of Troy, the structure of the programs are very, and that has happened both on the clean heat side, and I think on the LM side as well, where Donovan mentioned the focus of the benefits and so on. So I guess what we're putting here forward are some of the boots on the ground activities that are happening with respect to the clean energy ecosystem in the state of New York.
I like that you mentioned that there's a whole process to developing these incentives. Again, we do have students here. one of the things people might think when they hear energy efficiency, solar, these very obvious things, but not understanding that this field, this career track, encompasses so many specialties. So for instance, when they're putting together a incentive, there are engineers that are working on calculations. There are analysts that are working on calculations. There are people collecting data. There's so many things in this field. I'm going to sort of go around. So the way that I see it, I see Gregory, I see Chris, I see Donovan, and I see Owen. So I would like to start with Gregory and just give me three, I would say, career paths for someone. Let's say if they were working for Con Ed. Three
Sure.
career paths.
Yeah. So let me start with this. Con Ed as a company will probably for the foreseeable future still bring that power, pipes and wires, right, to our customers. Meaning that whether we have fossil generated power or wind generated power, our pipes and wires probably will be in operation for some time to come. So some of the core jobs that we have in Con Edison, from the guys that you see in the blue van to our control centers and all of what we call our core operations will probably remain. And those jobs have been around for a couple hundred years, and they'll probably continue. They'll probably continue. So the point I want to make is that we have some stock jobs that will remain. So one portion. And then we have our entire set of clean energy jobs, which I think is probably, the jobs that you're probably more speaking to, Leslie. But we have, for example, in our organization, everything from, we call them energy engineers, right? The guys who review the projects as they come in, ensure that they meet the savings, ensure that they meet the BCA that Owen is talking about, and approve our projects. We have energy inspectors, folks that go out post-installation, right, and say, okay, yes, this job has met the requirements, A, B, C, D, and it's okay to now, approve this job. And then we have an entire really financial operation that optimizes, right, and looks at, how do we programmatically really spend prudently our authorized funding. So what I tried to lay out there was that there are what we would call standard engineering jobs, audit jobs, and other jobs that you can pull from other industries, get what we would call the energy efficiency spin on it, and have a career. Certainly at Edison, I would suspect, NYSERDA with at Urban Green and maybe at Con Ed. But I'll let my colleagues dive more into that.
And Urban Green Council, not one of the utilities, but most definitely something very important that we depend on. Can you just give us a little bit of background about what you do, who the Urban Green Council is, and same question to you, maybe three career paths within the policy environment?
Yeah, absolutely, Leslie, thanks. So Urban Green Council, where I work, is an environmental nonprofit. We're focused on reducing the carbon footprint of buildings. We're primarily focused on New York City, but we also work statewide and occasionally on federal initiatives. Basically what we do is research, tech research, building research, workforce research, a lot of policy development and advocacy to help fashion solutions and get them implemented through laws and regulations. We also do a lot of education, training, and public programs aimed at equipping the workforce and getting the message out on a range of sustainability topics. So we directly weigh in a lot of the processes that Owen and Greg and Donovan were mentioning in terms of the utility rate making and NYSERDA and state level policy development. Three roles or paths in my field that I think are particularly interesting to this audience. One is what I do, which is essentially policy development and advocacy. There are plenty of lawyers in that space. I am a lawyer by background, and there's a lot of us in that space. I think there are not enough engineers, frankly. It is a very technical subject, this energy transition that we're talking about. And it's a real need and real benefit to the policy development and advocacy when the technical folks are rolling up their sleeves at the table rather than in the field to help fashion the right solutions. So there certainly are some, but I think that's one area. A second area is on the data side. We work with a ton of data trying to understand what's happening in buildings and where policy should go because of what's happening in buildings. There is an absolute wealth of information out there now, increasing automation in the building systems operating through complex software programs. The energy professional of the future is increasingly required to be as conversant in data platforms as the nuts and bolts of a building system. And we certainly see that in the policy space where we try to bring very, very complex information, synthesize it, simplify it, and get it to market for the workforce, for the residents of housing in New York City or New York State, for other nonprofits engaged in the space, et cetera. And the data analysis piece of that is really just a booming field, and certainly beyond the policy realm as well. And then lastly, Leslie, you alluded to this earlier, but just the importance of getting the message out. How do we reach the broader public? And that's the communication side of things. So we have a team focused on that. Urban Green is very focused on creating digestible, accessible information for the policymakers, for the general public, for the city council member who might not know very much about a particular energy or carbon subject. And so, that depth of technical understanding, experience on the engineering side or on the building operations side is incredibly valuable in the communication space as well.
So marketing.
Got it.
Okay. And Donovan,
okay,
NYSERDA.
So at NYSERDA, over 90% of the employees are either engineers, scientists, policy developers, or energy analysts. And I'm none of those. I'm a business person. I'm an MBA. And and this I know, the previous CEOs of both Con Edison and National Grid, I do have one thing in common with them. We're all Stern alum. They're all MBAs. So as we get into this energy ecosystem, it's about business. Okay, it's about developing businesses. So we really need more business people. We need marketers, we need communications people, we need the engineers, the install, all of that with complete ecosystems. But I know when Chris was talking earlier, I was like, oh no, I'm a business person, monopoly, like, but we also need to find other areas to create competitive businesses so we can attract investors in the space.
That's a very good point. I know that some of the projects depend on investors. And especially as you, Chris, mentioned earlier, when we talk about scaling up, there was something that I think it was you who said before, it has to be attractive for people to put money into it. So yes, having a business background, understanding how to do a pro forma analysis or to analyze those things, that's just another one. So we have marketing, we have business management, we have the hardcore lines and pipes. We have those. And Owen, what do you think?
I'll try not to repeat any of the excellent points that have already been made. Greg touched on the sort of core utility work that is likely to continue. And as we think about sort of the journey to net zero, continuing to have pipes and or wires is not necessarily inconsistent with that journey, right? And that's an important thing. Just as the electric grid is becoming less carbon intensive over time, we are looking at ways to make the pipes and the material that they're carrying become less carbon intensive over time. We have used fossil-derived methane historically as the natural gas that is sold to customers. But there are a lot of areas that we're starting to explore, including renewable natural gas, or RNG, which is natural gas that's captured from places like landfills or wastewater treatment facilities, and then using that as a replacement for fossil-based gas because it's what's called a closed carbon cycle. And so it is not adding more carbon to the atmosphere than would either otherwise have been there or then was sequestered during the growth of the organic material that produced it. So there's those sorts of technologies, as well as hydrogen is something that we're exploring, and that could be a potential replacement for some of the methane that's in the system. And so all of that is to say, even within the core engineering work that may be done, there's a significant shift in terms of the topic areas that are being explored and in terms of the capabilities that people might need to be bringing to that work as we think about solutions that are committed to the outcome, which is getting to net zero emissions, right? And we don't want to be, in our perspective, we want to make sure that we are committed to that vision, but not deciding a priori what path we'll take to get there. We want to make sure that we're continuing to test, to keep an open mind, because as Donovan did say correctly, we don't want it to be that it's a monopolistic perspective to that. We want to say, what are the new technologies that are coming out, right? It was only 15 years ago that the iPhone first emerged, and look at what that has enabled in terms of different ways that we engage with each other and engage and look at the value that's been created for so many companies based off of the technology that's contained within those devices. So we don't want to necessarily make a decision that says this is what it is and shall be henceforth. We want to make sure that we're still open to experimentation and learning. So as I'm thinking about hiring for my team, I'm looking for people that do have different backgrounds. I don't want to just get the straight sort of MBAs from whatever school it may be, or necessarily a strict engineer or anything like that. I'm looking for people that have new experiences, that have new perspectives that they can bring into this. I'd love to be working with people that have an environmental science background. I'd love to be working with people that do data analytics. I'd love to be working with people that do consumer advocacy and thinking about how we influence others, or economics and considering the behavioral economics of decision making and how we get to people at the point of decision. At the end of the day, there are a myriad of different pathways that can be taken within any of the organizations. And in fact, I think a lot of openness to paths being defined by the applicants and by the employees as they recognize areas of valuable exploration. So I don't want people that are listening to this to say, if I go work for a utility, I'm going to be turning the same wrench or, whatever it may be for 50 years and then just, retiring, right? That's not how the world works anymore. It's certainly not how our companies are working. And that's not necessarily the attitude that we're looking for in our employees. We want people that are constantly challenging, as we say at Grid, find a better way every day. And that's really a value that we keep front of mind. And so that's what I would encourage people to think about as they're considering how they can participate in this sector as well.
Thank you for that. I want to go back to Donovan just briefly on that when we talk about some of the incubator programs or programs that have been set forth for people to actually go and sort of innovate, because I know that NYSERDA has those programs.
We do. It's in our innovations area. We actually have a team that's called Tech to Market, where they're taking early stage, called like angel investor level companies that it's just like a twinkle in someone's eye that they have an idea to try to see if they can bring it to market. Actually, NYU has a Urban Futures Lab that does some of the things, and I think NYSERDA supports them, and I've actually spoken at several of their webinars. So yes, there are avenues to do this. If you have the next best idea, bring it to us. We certainly want to be the ones to help you incubate it, develop it, and bring it to market.
Yes. Thank you for that. Now, we have
Leslie,
about, yes.
Could I just add one thing to that point,
Yeah,
which
sure.
is sometimes easy to imagine, especially given the wealth of information that is out there, the wealth of studies and policy papers and conversation that's happening around the energy transition. It is very easy, I think, sometimes to reach the conclusion that everything is known, the pathway is set, and that we're sort of, all kind of marching in the same direction on all of this. But I think Donovan's point of, if you have the next best idea that can help us to get there faster, that can help us to get there in a way that is less disruptive, that can help us get there by engaging folks that have historically been underrepresented or even disadvantaged in energy systems of the past, we are still figuring all of this out very actively. And so I just want to make sure that the message is heard loud and clear by the audience, that we are still looking for input. We are still open to solutions, and we very much want to hear from everybody who's interested in this, because this is going to be investment decisions and energy systems that will affect us, our children, and hopefully children's children and future generations. And so we want this to be something that is developed in a very holistic and engaged and inclusive way. And we don't know all of the answers, and I don't want anyone to think that that's the case either, right? We are still exploring a lot of this, and we need to make sure that we have as many people at the table as possible.
So I'll put a challenge out to all those young folks. If you've got a great idea, bring it.
Okay, so and that sounds a little simple, because it's about giving them the directions or really understanding how, and I'm sure that we can. What I want to do is take 2 minutes each. Well, what we're going to do is each one of you will ask someone else in this panel a question, and you have 2 minutes to answer. After that, we're going to take the questions that have been coming through from the audience. Okay, so who's ready to go first, Rejan?
I'll go first.
Wow, really? This is like a class here.
Actually, I'm going to ask a question of both.
You'll ask? Okay, go
I'll
ahead.
ask a question to both Owen and Greg. So it's the same question as you.
Okay.
Okay, understood. So Owen and Greg, you got 1 minute to answer that. I'm splitting you two.
So we have this program, statewide program called New York State Clean Heat, where we're asking utilities to not only just think of how they perform and grow clean heating and cooling in their service territory, but also how the impact it has on the broader state. So we're asking them to think of the impact that they have on other utilities and helping the state achieve the statewide goals. What's their thinking on that and their approach to how we accomplish the statewide look with territorial approach?
Gregory?
Yeah, let me so I think the fact that we do have what we call the statewide clean heat program, as well as the statewide LMI program, has really encouraged utilities, in my view, to work in a manner that we have been done so before, really to get together and put together a program that as I was saying lightly before, works in Staten Island as well as it works in upstate New York. And I think the learnings of that will allow us to really scale program execution as we go forward, because at least it is in my opinion that utilities are close enough to their customers, or one of the closest entities to customers, to really force multiply and scale these clean energy efforts, right? I see that being one of the roles that utilities can certainly play in that area, and that's my initial thought.
Okay, Owen?
So I think going back to my comment about us not having every answer, one of the things that I've been very encouraged by is how many of our utility partners are reaching out to each other and are actively sharing information with each other. And so as we think about there being a framework like Clean Heat that's certainly helpful. It's a wonderful, I think, structure to be able to make sure there are standard kind of program rules. But we also want to go beyond that, because we know that by the time a program has been filed and approved and put forth, a lot of detail potentially has been, removed for the sake of clarity and brevity. And so we want to get into those conversations, right? We want to understand what was considered and then eventually removed and why, so that we're not making the same decisions or the same mistakes potentially without having an understanding of what others have gone through. So I think it's that an active involvement and engagement beyond simply the regulatory filings that's going to be so meaningful.
Thank you. So, Chris, a question.
Yeah, I've got a question. I'll aim it at Donovan, but I think anyone can really weigh in if they have anything to add. So we mentioned heat pumps a few times today. They're clearly part of the vision for buildings in the clean energy future. We hear a lot of what I would call misconceptions about heat pumps. And Donovan, I'm wondering what misconceptions you hear at NYSERDA about heat pumps that may be slowing progress on adoption. What are people saying about heat pumps or asking about heat pumps that isn't right, and that we need to sort of set the record straight on?
Well, the main question is, can it heat a building in cold climates? And that really applies to air source heat pumps. And manufacturers are making equipment that certainly go down almost full capacity at 5 degrees, which very rarely we go down to 5 or below in New York City. But upstate, that's an issue. So that really is the big thing. We are developing a communication strategy, talking points to try to address that. But that is the number one thing. That does not apply to geothermal or ground source heat pumps or water source heat pumps. But the most dominant heat pump being installed right now are air source heat pumps. So
Air source.
Making that question relevant.
Okay. Gregory?
Yeah, sure. I have one for Don. Don, so as the New York State's clean ecosystem really continues to evolve, do we see, or do you see the role of NYSERDA evolving? And if so, in what direction or directions will NYSERDA focus on, right? Going forward.
So NYSERDA, we consider ourselves sort of a clean energy hub, or in terms of analysis, policy recommendations. We have been very active with the governor's office and the Climate Action Committee. Department of Public Service looks to us to do a lot of analysis. So looking at future technologies, because heat pumps are the technology of today, but not necessarily needs to be or will be the technology 10, 15, 20 years from now. Because when we look through the history of how we heat our space, not buildings, go from caves to now, first it was dung, then it was wood, then it was coal, then it was oil, now it's then it's gas, now we're saying electrically driven heat pumps. There will be some, then could be hydrogen. So we see ourselves of really being on the cutting edge, leading edge, and trying to find out what is the next technology to advance and get us closer to our objectives.
Okay. And Owen.
So my question will be for Chris. And Chris, as we think about the sort of unique building stock in New York City, and we talked a little bit about NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority's buildings earlier, what do you, from your work with the Urban Green Council, see as some of the challenges for that building stock? And if there are any specific challenges for buildings in New York City that you think you'd like to call out to this audience?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for that question, Owen. I think there's no doubt it's a difficult transition that's going to require a lot of work. And the dense urban environment in New York City presents a handful of unique challenges. When we're talking about decarbonizing buildings in New York City, we're basically talking about deep efficiency, and we're talking about electrification, which Donovan explained earlier, transitioning the fossil fuels burned on site to electric systems that can then tap into the cleaner grid. There are some other sort of components to the strategy, what are often called distributed energy resources, things like batteries in buildings, some rooftop solar, et cetera. But a lot of it comes down to deep efficiency and electrification. In New York City, the commercial sector is already substantially electrified. So a lot of the large office towers are running on electricity, certainly much more than the multifamily sector. Many have been investing in energy efficiency for the last decade or more as well, through some of the first generation efficiency policies in New York City. So the really sort of hard to decarbonize sector that we have our eyes on is the multifamily sector. That's the biggest challenge. And I think we heard a little bit about some of the barriers or challenges we need to deal with. Huge amounts of the larger multifamily buildings in New York City are heated by old steam distribution systems, radiators in the rooms that are heated by from boilers in the basements, and those are 19th century technology. It's not easy and it's not cheap to get rid of those systems and replace them with a 21st century technology. So there are just some in-building infrastructure challenges there, and then the cost picture for sure. There's also things like wiring. Do the buildings have the electrical service they need in order to function with a fully electric, high efficiency heating, hot water, and cooking systems? And we have a lot of questions to work through there. There are, of course, other challenges just related to the dense urban nature of New York City. Heat pumps have an indoor unit, air source heat pumps have an indoor unit and an outdoor unit. We need to put those outdoor units somewhere. There's less roof space available in New York City. There's a lot of competition for that roof space. There are regulatory barriers, things like the historic buildings regulations that are there for a very good reason, but also mean it's a little more difficult to find the spaces on the facade of a building to mount external units. So there are some kind of building level layout and space constraints that we need to work through there. And then lastly, we're talking about existing buildings primarily. As we often say, 85% of the buildings that we're going to have in 2050, we already have today. Those are the ones we really need to decarbonize. And they're all full of tenants. So we have to figure out how to do this either with tenants in place or in a way that involves the natural turnover in tenant spaces. And that's really difficult in the multifamily sector. So there are pilots to do this. NYSERDA's got some great programs focused on testing out different ways to do this. There's a competition called the Empire Building Challenge that's looking at creative retrofit strategies for these buildings. But no doubt there are challenges there that many of us on this call, and then certainly many beyond, are focused on that we need to get over.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take some questions from the audience. I'm sorry.
I was going to ask you if you mind if I ask myself one question. It's weird.
You're going to ask and answer? You're going to ask and answer yourself?
Yeah, so if you can advise the students listening as to what to think about to give them either an advantage or an edge in terms of the future, what would it be? And there are three things, but two main things. We all know about solar, but this is a scientific fact. The sun radiates enough energy on planet Earth in 1 hour to power every single building on the planet for 1 year. But we don't have the technology to harness that energy. Our solar panels are about 22% efficient. So we can't, so literally in a couple of hours, we can have a couple of years of energy stored. So energy
wow,
stored.
Donovan.
Okay, so
it sounds like you're throwing down the gauntlet for these students.
Well, whoever can crack that nut is going to make a difference. The other thing, it's not being talked about much, but probably in the coming years, biomimicry, where you're literally taking what's in nature today and making copying it. A tree absorbs carbon dioxide and releases oxygen. Takes the sun, you can make it solar panels that look like trees. And the last thing is how do we utilize the greatest resource we have on the planet, because the planet is 3/4 of it is water. Whether it's through desalinization. This was years ago. I saw
Donovan, I'm sorry. We have 10 minutes left, and I want to take questions from the students because they have been paying attention.
Great.
The first question is, what are your thoughts on energy recovery ventilators? And will they enter the New York market like heat pumps have?
They're in the market. I mean, they basically absorb, they actually make heat pumps more efficient, quite frankly, because they're reducing the thermal need load for that heat pump. So we see that heat recovery ventilators is a part of the portfolio of clean heating technologies.
Okay. So here's a question. It was, how do we get access to energy policy research papers? I did post the Public Service Commission website, and that's where a lot of the policy is written. Now, in terms of research papers, I'm thinking going to Urban Green Council, as you mentioned, the research that you do. Is that public?
Yes, absolutely. So, there's sort of two paths here. One is to go straight to the primary source, go in and see the order from the Public Service Commission that's addressing the clean energy standard, for example. The other avenue that's maybe a little more accessible, if you're not deep in the weeds already, is an organization like Urban Green Council, and there are others. We aggregate and highlight and flag for our membership, for anyone subscribed to our newsletter, cutting edge developments in New York and beyond in the energy space, particularly with buildings. And there are others. There are great sort of email blasts to get on from organizations like AABE, which is the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. But locally, Urban Green Council is a great one. We are a membership organization. We actually have free membership for any students. So I would encourage you to go to our website and join us while you can for free. You'll get some programming for free, some for a discounted price, plus our newsletter, weekly newsletter with lots of energy developments in New York, and that includes energy policy papers when relevant.
Leslie, go ahead.
I would encourage them to look at some of the national labs. Acronym NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab. That's funded by Department of Energy. Oak Ridge National Labs. That's funded by Department of Energy. They have one in Berkeley, National Labs.
Or the Department of Energy, DOE.
Department of Energy, right.
Leslie, I was just going to quickly say there's a tremendous number of resources within New York City as well. So Columbia University has their Center on Global Energy Policy, CGEP, which is a world leader in terms of a thought leader as well in terms of energy policy, particularly, and really thinking about the interplay of a lot of these issues. So that's a very good resource. There's also a group called the Young Professionals in Energy in New York City, which does a lot with both National Grid and Con Ed and community organizations. They host things like fireside chats. So it's a great chance to get to know others that are sort of interested in this space, as well as some of the people that are working in it. And of course, I would say, we're on the AABE webinar here today. I would be remiss if I didn't say, I'm sure there's a tremendous number of resources that the AABE puts out. And so I would encourage you to sort of fully, engage with that organization and really look into the resource library that they may have, because I have no doubt there's a tremendous amount there on offer.
Owen, you must be psychic. I don't know if you can see the questions, but one of the questions was, who do we connect with? Who do we network with in organizations? Not necessarily who do we get a job with. And I do know that the Young Professionals in Energy, they do events. Obviously things haven't happened over the last 2 years like they used to, But just make sure that you reach out, because I can tell you, as someone in this field, if you like this field, you'll meet other people who like this field. We tend to talk to each other because, you know, maybe some of our other friends don't understand why we're so hyped about the things that we do. But you will meet like-minded people, and one thing leads to another, and you will have great conversations about something that you're truly committed to. And I'm saying that from personal experience. The other question had to do with hydrogen. And let me read it exactly. Okay. Is hydrogen going to be a major player in New York City?
So Leslie, why don't I start on this one, and then others can certainly jump in. You know, again, the title of this talk is so important, the journey to net zero. What matters at the end of the day is getting to net zero. And there may be a number of technologies that contribute to us reaching that goal, but we have to ensure that all of them are being deployed in service of that goal. So hydrogen, I think, could be an important component of the future energy system. Chris was mentioning that there are some old buildings where they have a steam distribution system and they're heated in a central mechanical room. If it proves that it's too difficult, too expensive, or too disruptive to put in systems like heat pumps into those sorts of buildings, could you potentially use hydrogen as a replacement for fossil-based methane to generate that steam and then take advantage of the existing distribution system within the building? And would that be beneficial overall? And we have to think about the life cycle carbon impacts of any fuel and how it's being used on site. But that's one way it could factor in. Certainly things like heavy transport as well. There's been a lot of discussion over the past few years in terms of would electric vehicles or something like a hydrogen vehicle make sense for all the trucks, all the shipping container ships that are out there, and potentially even aviation, you know, these sectors that are typically identified as hard to decarbonize. And then I will just say that there are, of course, as we think about the economy, there are a number of industries that are generally kind of designated as EITE, energy intensive and trade exposed industries. So these can be things like semiconductor manufacturing or metallurgy or things like that, where they require a tremendous amount of energy in a very specific form in order to do what they're doing today. That doesn't mean that that might not change over time with innovation, but if they require an extremely high temperature flame for their process, we need to think about how they would get that flame in the future. It can't be coming from a fossil-based source unless we're doing some form of sequestration or offsets. And so potentially you could use a different gas as a drop-in that would have a lower carbon intensity and be more consistent with net zero. So I think it is likely.
I'm sorry. Yep. She's giving me the warning. So I think we're down to a 3-minute warning. And I'm hoping that the audience has gotten a lot out of it. We'll definitely take some of the information, look up that information. Oh, she said, no problem, you can extend. Sorry, Owen.
It's okay. I was just going to say, I think it is likely to be a part of it. But again, we need to ensure that everything that we're doing is being done in service of that net zero goal. Because if we don't get to net zero, there's a whole host of other terrible things that will happen. And so we want to make sure that all of the investments are being made to help us get there more quickly and in a way that is less disruptive.
Well, since we are extending, I think I've gone through the immediate questions. One of the areas I do want to talk to, and none of you are directly involved in this, but there are local laws, right, that are coming out in New York City and New York State. Well, not so much New York State, but New York City, which hits hardest. And one of the reasons is because we have a very large building stock. And so I just want to talk about the sort of carrot and the stick. Meaning, do it, we'll give you incentives. Oh, you didn't do it? Now you're going to get a fine. And why those are coming up, and how what we do in terms of helping buildings reduce and that type of career really is helping where we live immediately, and also building owners financially. So no one wants to take on that New York City logo?
I mean, I could take up, but I know Chris is probably closer to the New York City, but from a sort of nice, well, kind of NYSERDA perspective.
NYSERDA is our carrot.
Yeah, but we recommend the stick as well, too. I mean, so we are making recommendations on both sides. But because of the long useful life of this equipment, the average for residential is 15 years for the HVAC system or air source, and about 25 years for ground source heat pumps, and the pipes that they use both for gas and for geothermal is about 100 years. Once you get into commercial, this equipment will last 30, 40 years. So if we have a goal that's really for 2050, anything that's put in, any fossil fuel-based system that's installed 2030 or beyond will not help us achieve our goals. So so right now is the ramp up of, we really need to be doing this. So it's a lot of carrots. But at some point, once we reach a year or a level where we now know that based on the current trends, there's no way we're going to hit these goals because the equipment being installed are not the equipment that's going to get us to net zero, then you're going to start seeing more sticks.
Yeah, I mean, I think simply put, we're not moving fast enough. And so many in the advocacy community, many on the public policy side of things are looking for more sticks to make us move faster. There are two big ones in New York City in recent years in this space related to buildings. One just passed in December, and it's a requirement for essentially all electric new construction starting in 2024 and then phasing in through different building sizes between then and 2027. So that means soon new construction in New York City will be all electric. That kind of goes back to the issue we were talking about before about barriers. A lot of the barriers are in the existing buildings. We need to stop building more new buildings that are going to cause retrofit problems down the line. The cost is actually quite similar to build an all-electric efficient building. So we're not even talking about a cost premium really when you're talking about new construction. The other big one is Local Law 97. Many of the audience may have heard of it. It is what's often called a building performance standard. It sets a carbon performance cap for large buildings in New York City, over 25,000 square feet. That's about 25 apartments in a multifamily building. And those kick in 2024. So that is a major shift in terms of sticks, and it's accompanied by some potentially significant fines for non-compliance. I think we still have a lot of work to do to get that law implemented in the right way. But it is a very strong market signal that we need to get all hands on deck and start making this happen.
And the utility companies are very quiet. And one of the reasons is with your incentives, I know that people are tending to use your incentives to help them to get into compliance with some of these local laws. Do you match your incentives in step with what the local laws are? I know, Owen, you mentioned earlier, you look at what the cost benefit will be to the incentives, and that there's a bunch of people working on a lot of numbers and saying, okay, well, if you implement this, you'll save this many therms and so on and so forth. But do you sort of match your incentives to the local laws that you know are coming out so that you can help the customer? And I mean, if the answer is no, the answer is no.
I would say it's slightly different, which is that, we are aware, of course, of things like Local Law 97 that may be impacting customers that we serve. And so that might be an opportunity for us to engage with that customer and say, we understand that based off of your current energy consumption, your building size, that in the future, this could impact you. Are there ways we can help you today so that you avoid those fines? So we aren't going to modify the incentive rate based off of that local law for the most part. There are some instances where there are kind of geo-targeted incentive rates, but typically you keep the incentive level the same, but it can be an opportunity to say, you're looking at this as a spend money now, and maybe you don't want to spend money now to invest in a new energy system. But if you don't spend the money now, you might spend more money in 5 years, or whenever the building would cross a threshold. And so that can allow us to present a full picture to that customer, making the carrot seem more appealing relative to the upcoming and certain stick. And so I think there's almost inevitably sort of a transition point that will happen in these sorts of systems. We've seen it in energy, and we've also, of course, more recently, as we think about the world we've been living in for the past few years, we've seen it in terms of the vaccination that's been happening, right? Where it initially was, we'll make it free, we'll make it accessible. Krispy Kreme donuts will give you a free donut every day for a year, right? And then we've seen, as adoption rates have slowed, and there's still a sense that it may need to increase, that we've started to have mandates be coming out. We've started to have change in policy to try to achieve what's deemed to be a societal good. And so I think that's the question, and similar reactions may occur as we start to shift from a carrot framework to a stick framework, as we've seen with mandates coming out. But if we are, again, all committed to the net zero vision, we need to ensure that there is policy in place so that, to Donovan's point, we're putting in equipment that will help us to get there.
Yep. No,
Okay.
and just to close out, by these all well good points by Chris, Donovan, and Owen. I would just add that, going back to an earlier point I made, and I think Grid probably shares this view. We all in on this clean energy commitment, right? Journey to net zero, I think, will be all in. I think carrots and sticks will be a number of tools that we will use to get towards this journey. And I view our current utility incentives as an enablement, as I think Owen is saying, right? Just part of that enablement tool, right, to continue to buy down so that folks mitigate the impact of the stick going forward. So that's how I view utility incentives and the impact today with respect to mitigating local laws, possible fines down the road.
I would like some final comments from each of you, just to wrap up with our audience.
Maybe I start. So I was very pleased. Is it okay?
Yes.
Very happy to be on this panel with Owen, Donovan, and Chris. I think hopefully we're able to shed some light on this journey to net zero and add some value to the thought process, particularly of the students. I was thinking about, in my mind, I was thinking I'm talking to a bunch of students. So hopefully we were able to add value today to your thought process, to your job hunt. I personally am available for a conversation, whether via the AABE network or, as the case may be, particularly to students to have conversations on anything green energy. And, I wish everyone well. Thanks for having me.
Chris?
Yeah, I think I'll offer just two parting thoughts. One is to bring us back to where we started, the idea of making this path to our climate goals equitable and inclusive. I would say, we really at Urban Green sort of philosophically think that climate equity and health are really all part of the same picture. And so, stepping even farther back from just climate and equity, it's the broader project of a clean energy future that's also healthy, that's also equitable and inclusive. And so that's kind of the guiding star. And I think that's reflected in a lot of the policymaking direction as well. Donovan was mentioning the requirements for reinvestment under the state level legislation. And then my second thought is just to echo what Greg was saying, that I'm very much available to chat in deeper fashion about anything we've covered today. Be happy to share information about Urban Green. So for all the students listening, please feel free to reach out at any time. Happy to connect.
Donovan.
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me, Greg. Thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed this. Couple comments. We talk about these goals, and the goal of 2050. That's 28 years from now. Everyone, all about these panelists here, just add 28 years to the age you are now, and think of where you're going to be. The future, we are the first leg of this relay race. We want to pass the baton to you. Okay, so just like we say, clean energy is the future. You're the future. That's what you have in common. All right. So embrace it. And yes, we want to get to net zero, but we want you folks to be in it 100%.
Thank you. Owen.
Well, I was going to take the comment in a slightly different way than Donovan, causing me to question my own mortality here. But I was going to say that it's such a wonderful time and such an incredible opportunity to be involved in the energy sector during this next 3-decade period, because this is where we will see it change. This is where we will see if we are successful or not, whether we meet those ambitious targets that are being set 30 years out into the future. So it's an incredible sector to get involved in. I feel extremely blessed every day to work in this space and to work alongside thoughtful professionals like those that are on the panel. And of course, Leslie, like you, leading the panel. So thank you for your wonderful job moderating. I would just say to everybody that's listening, if this is something that interests you, we need interested and passionate people in this space. As Donovan said, we're going to need people that will continue to bring that enthusiasm and that new insight. And I would just say that there is a tremendous amount of material out there. You can learn everything you might want to know about this sector from publicly available resources. You have people like all of us on the panel who are willing to engage as well. So it's sort of like the old saying, you know, there are chairs available in the front row for anyone that wants to come down and take one. If you're interested in this space, you can get involved. You can make a difference today, and that difference will echo for generations. So certainly, as Donovan said, if you're interested, bring it.
I want to thank everyone on the panel for bringing your expertise, your experience, and willingly sharing with the students everything that you know. I'm sure they probably have more questions. And again, we're in a different environment. I would encourage any of the students to reach out and handle your networking the way that we have to handle it in this current environment. I was also reminded that this session will be on the American Association of Blacks in Energy New York MAC's YouTube page. So you'll be able to listen to this session again if you've missed some points. I encourage you also to reach out to some of the organizations that were mentioned so that you can start becoming connected if you're not. And the other point that I want to bring home is, while this may be a career path, it is a career path that you're taking on that is actually affecting your life. So whether you were in this career or not, clean energy, energy efficiency, sustainability, going to net zero, it all affects your life. You just happen to choose to be a part of this whole great, wonderful field. So I hope you continue. I'm Leslie Davis. I do energy management for the Archdiocese of New York. And I want to thank everyone again, and the American Association of Blacks in Energy for having us. And I hope to talk to you soon.